define these alternatives as shadow structures, which is any individual or group social organization that adopts an alternative logic to that of late capitalism, meets presented needs, and exists parallel to, not in direct conflict with, the hegemonic industrial system. And I want to hammer this point home that this is not an explicitly political structure. It's not political in nature when it starts, and it is specifically developing as a very practical activity meant to meet needs as the system fails to meet those needs. I think a lot of times we think of social change only in this political realm, or only in terms of protest or those kinds of activities, and it's very explicitly not meant to bring down the system, but exists parallel to the system. The specific shadow structure I discuss in my book is subsistence food production, which I define as more than 50% of food needs in and around Chicago. I talk to urban, rural, and suburban people, but I argue at the end of this presentation that we can look at much more than subsistence food production. There's plenty of activities where this theory applies. I also rely on Eric Olin Wright's interstitial transformation theory, which he talks about the creative processes that get developed in the cracks and spaces of the dominant system of power. And he goes into a little bit more detail than Berman, so there's a sort of cycle of extension in social empowerment and stagnation, and successive limits are encountered and eroded. So the basic idea here is that these alternatives come about, then there's pushback from the hegemonic system, and then new creative workarounds happen, and it's this sort of ebb and flow process. It's not linear. I don't think I need to argue here that there are failures of the economic system, including the coronavirus. Protests described here as blowing politicians' mind by slowly explaining that when people can't afford to live, they get mad, which is a simple explanation for, there's sort of seething anger at the failure of institutions and the failure to meet presented needs. Crisis of healthcare, crisis of unemployment, crisis of food distribution systems, to name a few. David Harvey's talked about how the crises of capitalism are baked into the system, insofar that as people, the larger population, upward transfer of wealth, the larger population doesn't have enough money to buy consumer goods, which then is the death knell for capitalism as it stops the economy from growing. And specifically related to industrial agriculture, here is an example of a graph. If you see corn, soybeans, and wheat, starting around the year 2013 or so, literally are negative yield, economic yield per acre. So they are only propped up by subsidies, and there are many different reasons that the industrial agriculture system cannot continue to exist, but this is one of the most glaring. The other, of course, is soil health and many others. So methods for my study, of course, I talked to subsistence food producers in 3 field sites. I did 60 semi-structured interviews, 100 plus hours of ethnography, and I basically went in with the question, why do people take part in this, and what resulted? So what I found is that subsistence food production starts out as an individualized activity. People want to do it for various reasons. The reasons are extremely diverse. The ideology behind doing it is extremely diverse. The activity itself is quite homogenous. People get a similar thing out of it, but they go into it for many different reasons, including distrust of the government, distrust of corporations, just a generalized feeling of alienation, and crisis and risk. But what happens is this individualized activity necessarily requires requires practitioners to reach out to others for help, and this is quite different from sustainable consumption, like buying organic food, which can stay as an individualized activity. Sustainable production necessarily requires a network of practitioners that people need to troubleshoot. People need to find materials. They need to source things. They need information and help on housing, on vegetable gardening, on so many things. So they're these sort of weak tie practitioner networks that extend beyond significant social barriers of geography, race, class, gender, and age. But more importantly, I would say that these practitioners connect despite their varying identities. So you can have, a sort of libertarian, NRA, conservative connecting with sort of hardcore progressive city person, and they don't really have to talk about that identity or attitudinal or ideology. They can go straight to, pests on the chickens or sourcing feed. So what happens, I argue, is that we move from these sort of private solutions that meet presented needs to more public ones. So an example from my data of a political shadow structure, a social movement activity, is that when people in the people who were keeping chickens in Chicago were under attack from a council person who was trying to ban chicken keeping within the city limits, and basically they mobilized to stop this ban from happening. And the way they mobilized was also really interesting. They didn't protest, they didn't lobby. What they did was they created a chicken coop tour, which was an open tour of all the people who wanted to open their backyards to show their chicken coops to others. And basically what happened is showing their coops to others made connections with neighbors who are, also constituents of the city council person. It lowered the stigma, and it sort of built this strength in connection of normal people to one another. Another political activity they did to stop this ban from happening is they provided resources to across their network on other cities' policies. And sharing that information horizontally armed the group to combat this attack, and eventually they were successful. I also argue that there are sort of economic shadow structures or alternative economic arrangements. Practitioners shared animal manure in exchange for vegetables, or too many animals produced in a city lot in a relationship with somebody with rural plot of land. Sort of exchanging animals and animal products, sharing information, seeds, plans, chicken coops, animals, food products. And the more time I spend here in Uruguay, the more I realize that there are so many alternative economic arrangements that are just not measured. And I think if we're trying to think about social change in relation to food or to other economic arrangements beyond food, we have to keep in mind that there are these alternative economic arrangements that are not being measured, that can be very powerful and very positive. So the takeaway from the study, I would argue, is that practitioner networks allow for inclusive social movements. So there's not this ideological barrier. They can be mobilized to create new political, economic, and social structures, which I call shadow structures. And people rely on these new structures as the larger capitalist system fails. If they can't, if there's no food in the store, for example, people have these alternative economic arrangements. They know who has chickens and who has compost and who has a garden and who has eggs and who has things to share. There are some good news. There's raising a larger awareness of the food system, monopolies, supply chains, and there's more and more interest in local food, farmers selling direct to consumers. In Scandinavia, this is growing exponentially, but other places as well. People are questioning consumption and materialism. But if you don't take away anything else from my presentation today, I really want to highlight this slide. I'm going to take a couple minutes on this slide. So I think a lot of times we think of social change as the civil rights movement. We think of it, we have an ideological vision of what should happen and how that can happen via top-down change, via changing laws. But I would argue that the political project of today is overhauling the entire system. In trying to imagine an overhaul of the entire system, we get into an imaginary space that's almost impossible, even for people who are like complex systems theorists, because it's very hard to hold in your head at the same time all of the different parameters of change and how those might play out in the real world and all the cascading consequences of this. So I would also argue that staying in this imaginary space, trying to imagine the next world and then implementing it, it's really just impractical, because any imagination that you would come up with for an alternative system isn't field tested. And so trying to imagine the perfect system first before trying to enact, to me seems it's kind of a spinning our wheels in trying to get the system that we actually want to see happen to actually happen. I would also argue that many of these ideas can be confusing or alienating or very elite. Even amongst environmental sociologists or environmentalists more generally, there's disagreement about which of these systems, between degrowth and donut economics and the circular economy and solidarity economies, would work. And I would argue that all of the jargon that comes along with the imagination of many of these ideas can be very alienating for normal people, and it makes it a very strong barrier to entry for a lot of people, and makes this movement stay in this sort of elite environmentalist space. Environmentalists tend to be, white, urban, liberal, highly educated. And I would argue that we need to have a more inclusive movement, and the way we can do that is learning from the practitioners in my study, by field testing our ideas. And field testing specific ideas or multiple specific ideas has so many benefits, and as I've learned from the data in my study, it not only strengthens the idea by testing it in the real world against real conditions, it also shows, not tells, other people how this idea is possible. Not only possible, but beneficial. If people see it and experience it, I was at so many of the chicken coop tour moments, aha moments, where people were coming and seeing the chicken coops and having this aha moment, like, wow, this is really great, actually. Whereas if you sit down at a kitchen table with them and tell them about how chicken coops are great, it's a little bit more alienating of a conversation. So show, not tell. It becomes a meaningful activity for the practitioner, one that they're willing to defend, as was shown in the study. It's easier to make community connection over shared behavior than these ideas. Like imagine going to a degrowth meeting. You have to have like a college degree or a large exposure to the kind of degrowth jargon that's used to participate meaningfully in those activities, whereas to go and just have a conversation about chickens, a very, very low barrier to entry. And then these communities of practice, once they get going, are quite resilient. And I also found that people innovated beyond the initial connection that they made. So that maybe they made a connection about chicken coops, but then they saw that the person was also keeping honey, or keeping bees for honey, and they asked about that. And now the person's into honey and chicken keeping. So it's this sort of virtuous cycle, I would argue. Finally, I just want to briefly say that beyond subsistence food production, there's plenty of other practical activities that I've come across and get behind, in terms of, not that these things are all perfect, but they're things that we can start field testing now. Planting perennials basically everywhere, chickens anywhere that there's low density, holistically grazing livestock, including poultry, but also ruminants in public parks, cemeteries, sports field, parkways, gray water gardens, passive solar water heaters, eco bricks, which are just basically empty water bottles that you put plastic waste into, and then you can build with those. Construction, either new or retrofitted, with passive solar principles, permeable pavers, clotheslines, cooperatives, sharings, and swaps. Solar ovens, buy local, selling local, and part of this informal economy. Compost toilet, and incorporating any of the above into education is really key. So the questions I have for discussion: will this crisis lead to further exploration of alternatives? Are shadow structures developing? Do you agree with me? What critiques do you have of this theory? What will persist? And I'm happy to discuss all of that. Thanks so much.